Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 11th lecture in our course on general psychology. In this lecture, we're going to continue our unit on learning. As I mentioned last time, we're going to talk about learning, and then next unit we'll talk about memory. Those are two very interrelated processes. But for this session, we're going to talk about a different kind of learning. We talked about some simple kinds last time with classical and operant conditioning. And now we're going to get into some more sophisticated forms of learning. So specifically, those more complex forms are going to be observational learning. That is where we witness the experience of others, behaviors and outcomes, and learn from that. And then also implicit learning, as opposed to explicit learning. So implicit learning is learning that we're not aware of. We'll also wrap up this unit talking about classroom learning, which may be a topic you're particularly interested in, given that you're taking a university course. In classroom learning, we know some about it. It is obviously an unusual form of learning, at least from an evolutionary perspective. The idea of the classroom and studying and academics are very, very new and are much, much newer than things like even observational learning, but certainly newer than conditioning or non-associative learning. So we'll talk about that. In this session in particular, what we're going to do is we'll see that not just people, both adults and children, but also animals can employ observational learning. You can learn by watching. For implicit learning, we'll see that learning doesn't require awareness. We tend to think of learning as a very active process, especially as students. So learning doesn't actually require awareness of either the learning process or even learning outcomes. We often don't notice changes in our own behavior or that we improve at a certain skill, for example. That's not really at the level of our awareness, and we'll talk more about implicit learning. And for both kinds, we'll see what parts of the brain are involved. So especially when it comes to implicit learning versus other kinds, implicit learning is really quite different and requires different parts of the brain. You can have an injury to the brain that impairs one kind of learning and not the other. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, I'll start by talking about observational learning. And before we get into examples, we of course need to define it. And you can probably deduce the definition from the name itself. This is learning by watching the actions of others. So most commonly, we witness someone else's behavior, we see the outcome of that behavior, and then we can either exhibit the same behavior or not. Last time we talked about the definition of learning, and part of that definition is experience. Here we're really depending on the experience of other people more than our own experience. But it is still an experience-based phenomenon. One of the most common ways as humans that we experience this is teaching through demonstration. And so, especially in a classroom setting, we can watch a math teacher solve a problem. And then, if the problem is solved successfully, we can then solve it in the same way later. Or if we're playing a sport, the coach can demonstrate a technique. We can learn to imitate that behavior. Or if you're learning a skill or a trade, if there's someone with years of experience, they can demonstrate how to use a tool or how to approach a particular kind of problem. And then you can witness the outcome and then imitate the behavior. A population that really depends on observational learning is, of course, children. Children learn an immense amount through watching others, particularly their parents, their siblings, their peers. And so children, especially before they get to school, learn a lot of things about social norms, for example, learn about behaviors by watching others. And there's a famous experiment done by a scientist named Bandura, Albert Bandura, and what he did was he had children watch videos of adults, and some of these adults treated the toy, called a Bobo doll, very aggressively. This is an inflatable toy, it's basically a punching bag. But the children watched the adults in the video behave aggressively, even violently toward this toy, and then Bandura observed what the children themselves did. And as it turns out, the children themselves behaved violently toward the toy. And you might say, well, it's a punching bag, of course they're going to treat it violently. What's interesting, though, is that Bandura had the adults exhibit very particular aggressive behaviors. So the children weren't generally violent. They were violent in the specific ways that they saw the adults being violent. And really importantly, the outcome mattered. So as they watched the videos of the adults, if the adults were rewarded for aggressive behavior, children were more likely to be aggressive too. If, however, they were penalized, punished for being aggressive, that is the adults, the children were less likely to exhibit aggressive behavior. So it's not simply a matter of children being violent toward this particular doll, and it's not even that they're imitating whatever behavior they witness. They're very much aware of the outcome of the behavior, and they can then decide to behave that way or not based on the outcome they witnessed. And it's not just humans that use observational learning. So primates, so monkeys and apes, can also learn observationally, either by watching each other or sometimes by watching humans. So primates can learn what things to be afraid of. As your book points out, observationally, a monkey can learn to be afraid of snakes by watching another monkey being afraid of snakes. Another primate or an ape, like a chimp, can watch somebody use a tool, even a simple one like a stick, and learn to use that tool themselves. So there's a lot of observational learning of primates, but also in other species. Certain species of birds, like ravens, can learn to use tools and can learn by observation to use those tools to get at food items, for example. There's a famous experiment with an octopus where one octopus was watching another, and that second octopus was opening a puzzle box in order to get at some food. And then the first octopus learned how to open the same puzzle box. That one's a little bit controversial, but there's a very real possibility that octopuses can learn observationally. Incidentally, the plural of octopus is not octopi. It's octopuses or octopodes. Fun fact. Anyway, octopuses, species of birds, may all be able to learn by watching other members of their species exhibit a behavior and then get a reward. There is an evolutionary influence here, though. So, for example, those monkeys can learn to be afraid of snakes by watching other monkeys. They can't learn to be afraid of flowers by watching other monkeys. So if you condition a monkey to be afraid of flowers, which you can do, you can condition them. But then other monkeys will not learn by their example. So there is a biological predisposition toward certain kinds of learning, certain kinds of stimuli. And this is a common theme. You also, in your book, it talks about how we can learn about which foods to avoid if they make us sick. And that's a much easier form of learning than other associations that we might make. We learn much more quickly about possibly dangerous foods than about other stimuli in the environment. And then finally, there's the possible issue of animal culture. So animals can learn from watching each other. A couple of interesting points here. First, chimpanzees can watch by observing humans or other chimps. When they're observing other chimps, if their native environment involves a lot of other chimps, they can learn how to use tools, but not very specifically. It seems like they can learn what a tool is used for, but not specifically how to use the tool, not how to hold it, not what motions to go through to use it. And so it seems that if animals have a culture, that certain kinds of information can be transmitted. The fact that certain tools can be used. It's only when chimps are around a lot of humans, though, that they learn more specifics about tool use, how to use the tools. Your book has an example of an experiment where chimps can learn to use a rake to pull in food from other chimps, but the specific method they don't pick up unless it's taught to them by a human and they're around humans a lot. There's some evidence that other animals also have culture in the sense that they learn specifically what tools to use or what kind of tool to use to get certain food items, for example, whether they open up a nut or shellfish using a particular kind of rock, for example. Anyway, so those are all examples of observational learning, not just in humans, but in other species as well. Okay, so that's observational learning. The other form of learning that we're going to talk about in this lecture is implicit learning. And this is learning that happens, as your book puts it, under the radar. So it's independent of being aware of the learning process. So we're not aware that we're learning anything at all. And even we're not even aware of the outcomes of that learning. We're not aware we're getting better at something. So this can be often something like skill learning, where through practice we get better and better at something, but we're not really aware of it. There are also tasks that start off being explicit and end up being implicit. At first, you're very aware of the process of practicing or learning, like in driving. And after a while, it becomes implicit. You make small adjustments to your skills without really concentrating on it, not paying attention. So implicit learning, there are a variety of examples. And these are examples that are used in a laboratory setting. So when we want to study implicit learning, there are a couple of different tasks that are commonly used to look at this process. One is what's called an artificial grammar task. And what that means is you have a series of symbols, usually letters, and they have rules. Now, in our normal grammar for language, there are rules about the order of words, which word to use after another word, how to conjugate verbs, and which nouns to put where. And of course, different languages have different sets of rules for how you combine words to create ideas. An artificial grammar task often uses letters, and there aren't words, but there are still rules. And so, for example, certain letters might be able to follow only certain other letters, or maybe certain letters can repeat and other ones can't, or maybe only a certain letter can come before a different one. So there are these different rules. And an implicit learning task, you're not told what the rules are. You're not told how many rules there are. You're not even told what kind of rules there are. All you're shown is sets of letter strings that follow the rules and sets of letter strings that don't. And you're shown these pretty quickly. You're not given time to analyze them and try and figure out what the rules are. You're shown sequences of these letter strings, and through trial and error, you discover which ones follow the rules and which ones don't. Now, what's interesting is that people tend to get much better at this. At first, of course, it's random. You don't know what the rules are. But after a while, they really improve to where they can get 2/3 of them right, for example. But even then, if you ask them what the rules are, they can't say. They don't know what the rules are. They just know that certain strings look right and certain ones don't. So they're following the rules without really even being aware of them. And they don't know that they've gotten better at this. Another type of task is what's called a serial reaction time task. And in this task, you have a series of lights on a bar or a series of squares on the screen that get symbols in them. But the point is that you see a sequence of lights or a sequence of these squares light up. So one at a time. What you're not told is that they follow a particular set of rules. They follow a particular sequence. And what you're supposed to do is press the button on your hands corresponding to the light or the box that lights up. And because there is a pattern, you learn this implicitly. And so you're not aware of getting faster at your responses, but you do. And people don't report what the sequence is. They can't. And yet there is a sequence, and they are getting better at anticipating it. And so that's a serial reaction time task. You can have a visuospatial task, where you have a grid of symbols, and there are, again, unknown rules that govern which symbols go where, how the symbols relate to one another. So some symbols might only be beside one another. Some symbols, maybe they can't be next to certain other symbols. A given symbol may always be on top of another one. But again, you're not told what the rules are. You can only learn through seeing one stimulus after another, and then after a while, your performance improves with regard to noticing whether stating whether something is correctly sequenced or not. Uh, what's interesting is that autism spectrum disorder, there are a number of deficits associated with autism and spectrum disorders related to it. Uh, however, uh, they are normal, or even better than normal, at implicit learning for visuospatial tasks like this one. And notice that I emphasize implicit. If you ask them what the rules are, they cannot articulate it, just like your control group cannot. They can't say what the rules are, but they are better at registering whether such a grid adheres to the rules or not. So interesting. Autism spectrum disorder, some deficits, but also perhaps some extra abilities. Okay, when it comes to the brain and these forms of learning, there are different areas that seem to be involved in observational and implicit learning. So for observational learning, we have what are called mirror neurons. And these are neurons found in the frontal lobe and also in parts of the parietal lobe. Not the whole lobes, just these parts. But what these neurons do is they become active whenever you engage in a certain action. So when you reach out to grab something, for example, or you move your body in a particular way, these neurons exhibit activity. And you might say, well, that's not surprising. Whenever we move our bodies, we're going to have neural activity that corresponds to that movement. And that's true. But these mirror neurons also become active when someone else makes the same action. So if you have a set of neurons that respond when you reach with your right arm to grab an object, those neurons, if they're mirror neurons, will also respond when you see someone else reach out for that object. So these are neurons that don't distinguish between who's making an action. They just seem to respond to this sort of action in general. And it seems to be important for observational learning. Neurons that are active when you do something or when I do something. Also, when it comes to observational learning, especially learning of sequences of physical actions like something in sports or a dance move or what have you, the motor cortex also seems to be important. We tend to think of the motor cortex as operating at a very basic level, controlling our body in terms of which muscles are going to contract. But it turns out the motor cortex is involved in observational learning as well. And if you use transcranial magnetic stimulation, which we talked about in the previous lecture, to inhibit motor cortex, you can kind of shut it down temporarily with TMS, that observational learning is impaired. You cannot learn as well without your motor cortex when you're observing someone else's physical actions. For implicit learning seems to use a different pathway in the brain from explicit learning. Explicit learning most commonly uses the hippocampus, which is a structure I've mentioned before, and we'll talk about it extensively in our next unit on memory. But implicit learning doesn't seem to require the hippocampus. And so you can have damage to the hippocampus, and somebody can't explicitly learn. They can't report their experiences. They can't remember facts, for example. They can't make new memories of events in their lives. But they can still learn new skills. So they can still get better at physical actions, for example, if those things are implicit. And so there are different parts of the brain involved in implicit versus explicit learning. Also, if you use one of those artificial grammar tasks. So again, those are sequences of letters. They don't make up words. And the person certainly isn't pronouncing these strings of letters, isn't pronouncing words. And yet Broca's area becomes more active during these artificial grammar tasks. Broca's area, as we've already seen, is active during the production of speech. But here the person isn't talking. And they're not even looking at words that they could pronounce if they wanted to. And yet, apparently, learning these grammar rules, these guidelines for syntax of what symbols can follow what other symbols, seems to require Broca's area. And of course, here in this diagram, this is from a paper that demonstrates this effect. We see Broca's area is active. So here's Broca's area in the frontal lobe. I've circled it on both of these slices of brain tissue. These are fMRI images. And so we can see Broca's area is more active than other parts of the brain. For the serial reaction time task, again, the motor cortex seems to be very important. If you use transcranial magnetic stimulation on the motor cortex, in observational learning, learning is impaired. But it also seems to impair implicit learning. So your response times don't improve if you have inhibited motor cortex. So we've talked about implicit learning, we've talked about observational learning. One form that you may be particularly interested in as students is classroom learning. So I'm going to talk here about what forms of studying seem to be effective, which ones seem to be less effective, just because it might be beneficial. So effective techniques include things like distributed practice. What does that mean? Well, it means studying and breaking the studying up across multiple sessions, not trying to do it all at once. And the idea here is that by doing that, you force yourself to recall the information and then store it again multiple times, maybe even many times. And so that seems to make recall easier when it's time for testing, for example. So by breaking it out into multiple sessions and forcing yourself to recall the information and then restore it over multiple days or even weeks. Interleaved practice has also been shown to be an effective technique, and this is different from distributed practice. So interleaved practice is when you don't study, even within a session, don't study the same thing or don't do the same task, practice the same task in one big block. You do one thing or study one topic, and then you switch to a different topic, and then you can come back to the first one. So the idea there is that what you're practicing is not just recalling and storing the relevant information, but the practice of deciding what sort of information you need. What technique do you need to apply here? What task do you need to engage in? And so not just the information that you need, but the process of deciding what information you need seems to be helpful. So let's interleave practice. Practice testing. So things like the practice quizzes that I post can be very useful. They're ways of assessing knowledge, so they force you to try to recall the information. And one of the reasons they're so helpful is that it's hard to fool yourself when it comes to practice tests. So you either know the information or you don't. You get feedback very quickly on whether you got the answer right or not. As we'll see here in a minute, that's in contrast to something like rereading the material. So practice testing, very good way of assessing your knowledge. There are some less effective techniques that people often use. One, of course, is cramming, where you try to do all your studying in one session. This is the opposite of distributed practice. And cramming is certainly better than nothing. You do retain some of the information, but not nearly as much as if you distributed your study sessions over a long period of time, over multiple sessions, especially if you get sleep between sessions. Sleep is very important for memory consolidation, it seems. Summarizing, also not terribly effective. So if you summarize the material, you have a general idea of what the material contains. You can demonstrate that, but that's rarely how tests work. So tests will often ask for detailed knowledge. So there's a mismatch there in terms of what you're trying to recall and what task you're performing, and what the exam will eventually ask you to do. So summarizing, not a very good match to a test environment. Highlighting and underlining, these are very common. So highlighting in the textbook which things you think are important. And people tend to overuse this. They'll highlight too much. They'll highlight an amount of material that you couldn't possibly commit to memory. And so it's not very good in terms of narrowing your focus down. And also the act of highlighting or underlining itself doesn't seem to make the material that much more memorable. And as I mentioned before, rereading is not a particularly effective technique. And the reason that is again, it's not how you're going to be tested, first of all. You're not going to be given the material and then asked, does this seem familiar to you? Rereading, we can fool ourselves into thinking we know something just because it's fresh in our memory. We just read it. So, of course, it seems familiar. And we can tell ourselves, oh, I know this because of that sense of familiarity. Where in reality, you're going to be tested on this hours later. And so that sense of familiarity can be misleading. And it's not a very good assessment of whether you actually know it or not. What you're really assessing is whether it seems familiar given that you just read it. So that's why rereading is not a particularly good technique. That will do it for our unit on learning. Next time, we're going to move from learning to memory. And these are very related concepts. Learning, as we've talked about, is the acquisition of new information, skills, knowledge. Memory is the process by which we store and retrieve information. So we'll talk about what memory is, first of all, distinguish it from learning. And there are many different forms of memory. So people talk about losing their memory, and really they're talking about a particular kind of memory. We have many different kinds, and you can lose some and not others. You can be good at some and not others. So we'll talk about the different kinds of memory and how they relate to one another. And we'll get back to the brain. We'll talk about how the brain stores memories, which structures of the brain are important for different kinds of memory. At the cellular level, how does the brain store memories? So we'll talk about all of that in that unit, and I will see you then.